Okay, people, the economic battle is taking an intriguing turn. We know the U.S. will not back down on its sanctions, whether they target Chinese technology or Russian goods. It is escalation after escalation. But now, targeted countries are striking back. A week ago, Biden tightened the screws on Gazprom Bank. This is the same bank that EU countries had to work with to secure their supply of cheap Russian gas. They would pay Gazprom Bank directly in rubles, and the Russians would deliver the gas to the buyers. U.S. sanctions severed this link and jeopardized Europe's energy supplies. Now Putin has reversed the script on the U.S. Russia has officially removed the necessity to pay for gas through Gazprom Bank. And this came after nations such as Hungary warned about extremely high energy prices. Because of the geopolitical scenario, EU gas prices have more than quadrupled in the previous 9 months, essentially driving their economies to the breaking point. There is no way to compete with US or Chinese manufacturing. Everything, from your automobiles to chemicals, is now extremely uncompetitive. Even if you tax China, you would lose worldwide market share. But let's speak about Putin's new edict, which is a great maneuver that creates a complicated network of different payment ways that will confuse the U.S. Gazprom Bank would remain the final destination for ruble payments. However, international purchasers can utilize other financial institutions to convert funds into rubles prior to the transfer. And this is an extremely critical distinction. If you are Hungary, you may avoid dealing directly with Gazprom Bank, which is under U.S. sanctions. The currency transaction might occur at another institution, which would subsequently transmit the amount to Gazprom Bank. It's another illustration of how U.S. sanctions may backfire. Russia now has 2 obvious choices for continuing to provide Europe with gas. They might form new entities and play whack-a-mole with the United States. Create additional banks where EU corporations may convert euros to rubles before sending funds to Gazprom Bank. Another alternative may be to enlist Chinese banks and have the EU transit the money to China. If the United States imposes penalties on China, we might be in for a brutal economic war. Regardless, Europe does not have many options right now. There is no way to shut off Turkey's last source of cheap electricity, and we can see the desperation. They want a reprieve from U.S. sanctions so that they may continue to buy Russian gas. Turkey's imports are for Europe. Now, Istanbul serves only as a transit point for the Russian supply's eventual destination, and it's clear that the EU is driving this effort for exemption. And, as Putin announced his edict, the price of gas began to decline by more than 2%. This confirms the importance of Russian gas to Europe. Regardless of what von der Leyen desires, Russian gas and LNG continue to account for 15% of total EU supplies. This is direct gas imports, and Europe is paying Moscow directly. We're not even including re-exported LNG from nations like China or some supplies provided by other parties. As a result, the number is most likely closer to 20%, if not 25%. However, the situation in Europe is about to worsen. While some gas supply passes through Turkey, a significant amount of gas still travels through Ukraine, and negotiations are underway to cut off this essential supply. Once this happens, the EU will be obliged to purchase more expensive alternatives. This, of course, refers to LNG from the United States and the Middle East. Europe is set to get hammered yet again. According to Gazprom's 2025 strategy, they've already anticipated the worst. There would be no more gas flowing via Ukraine to Europe, and if this occurs, several nations, including Austria, would be affected. This agreement provides around $1 billion in transit fees for Ukraine, hence it generates cash for Kiev. Gazprom wants it to continue, but Russia's basic case is that the transaction will be scrapped. If this occurs, the massive supply line, the Sudzha, would become inactive, and direct gas supplies to Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia will be interrupted. This exacerbates the current energy problem. This measure is more severe than the Gazprom Bank sanctions. If gas cannot flow through Ukraine, there is no use in discussing payments. It's a physical barrier, and Europe would undoubtedly suffer. Since 2022, around 5% of the EU's gas imports have gone via Ukraine transit. It generates more than 110 terawatt-hours of energy in the first 8 months alone. It may seem little, but this is most certainly the cheapest pipeline gas available in Europe. If this were to end, Russian gas would only have 2 options for transportation. One option would be to use the Turk Stream pipeline, which would connect Turkey to Serbia or Hungary. However, the most likely scenario is for the gas to wind up in China. And, knowing the Chinese, their companies require an abundance of inexpensive energy to be competitive. So Beijing would be delighted to purchase any extra supplies at a discount. This is the major threat that Europe faces in the next few months. The gas price increase is certain to continue. A new energy shock is about to occur. Given the current state of affairs in the EU, a supply disruption would be disastrous. This leads us to the issue of France. Macron's administration is on the edge of collapse, and Le Pen appears to be gaining momentum. Macron's ambitious ambition is in shambles, and his prime minister has left after only a few months. And now, Le Pen is one step closer to triumph. Much has been said about France's political instability, so I don't want to rehash it. Macron's push for quick elections proved disastrous, leaving France with no clear political leadership. But we must talk about the French economy, which is the second largest in the EU. And if France loses, Brussels will be in complete turmoil. They may even need to arrange a bailout. We only need to look at the French to German bond spreads to see how dangerous investors think buying French debt is. The greater this number, the more terrible the economic situation becomes. Since June of this year, French yields have risen dramatically relative to Germany, from less than 50 basis points to roughly 90. This is bad news for a country with a spending problem. Even a pledge to raise taxes and reduce expenditure by 60 billion euros did not inspire confidence. Nobody believes France can stop spending money. Macron passed the pension reform 1 year ago. The retirement age increased from 62 to 64, which was quite controversial. So imposing any more austerity on French citizens is untenable, and this is central to the government's demise. Barnier desired a rapid reduction in the deficit, while Le Pen prefers a gradual reduction, which presents another issue. Investors just do not trust France to keep its deficits in check, and ironically, the more bond rates rise, the worse it becomes for interest payments, pushing the deficit even higher. France has routinely failed its deficit objectives. The EU maximum is around 3%. This year alone, France borrowed and spent more than 6% of its GDP. This is just as awful as the United States. France's primary priority is to resolve its own political issues. It is a huge disaster, and with Macron refusing to go, it will only get worse. Business mood is deteriorating, and Le Pen's proposal to progressively decrease the deficit does not address the main issue. France, like Germany, is beginning to lose its industry and competitiveness. They are living much over their means, and the only remedy is for the economy to grow faster than the deficit. But is that truly possible? Firstly, we must face the impending trade war with the United States. We know Trump intends to impose a 10% tax on every country, including the EU. As a result, French exports are extremely vulnerable. Excluding the EU, 16% of French exports travel straight to the United States. That's almost 44 billion euros in stuff. Trump's tariffs threaten to drop this statistic and will undoubtedly reduce French GDP. You would assume that France would be banding together with its other trading partners, but we are witnessing the reverse. Because of French support for EV tariffs, Beijing is targeting French Conex exports to China. Tariffs can reach 39%, thereby causing a drop in domestic sales. Conex is a luxury item rather than a necessary commodity, and as a result, France has pledged financial support to the Conex business. As a result, massive subsidies are on the way, which will exacerbate France's debt. This is a huge shame because China's commerce with France is massive. Bilateral trade was approximately $80 billion in 2023, although this figure is expected to decline in the future. fewer EVs will be exported to France. As a result, fewer French products will enter China as well. So you can see the economic trap France is in. As the United States becomes more protectionist, French enterprises will find it more difficult to sell into this market. And until they develop plants in the United States, exports will plummet. French exports to the EU have likewise reached their peak. Since 2022, France has been pushing more goods into the single market. But a downward trend has begun. Dropping from 28.5 billion euros to 26 billion should not come as a surprise. The cost of living in Europe has risen dramatically as a result of rising energy costs. Cutbacks are inevitable, given that the majority of French exports are discretionary. You'll spend more money on groceries and gas than on French perfume, and this is just simple logic. The difficulty today is that additional headwinds are blowing from France. Macron must deal with more than just a trade battle. France opposes the forthcoming EU-Mercosur free trade deal, which will enable the free flow of agricultural goods between the EU and South America. This is problematic for France, since it includes nations such as Brazil and Argentina. These are major wheat and meat exporters whose production costs are significantly lower than French markets. They are not subject to environmental rules, and labor expenses are significantly lower than those of French workers. So lifting these tariffs will harm farmers all around Europe. This industry may only account for 2% of French GDP, but it is nonetheless significant due to the large-scale repercussions. It might wipe out the farmers. Despite France's efforts to prevent the sale, Gondolion has officially completed the agreement. There will be free commerce between the EU and South America. And this extends beyond food imports. The EU understands that Latin America, particularly Brazil, is a major market for auto exports. Tariffs on imports into Latin America currently exceed 30%. Taking this away will allow greater EU auto exports into the continent. At least that is the plan. However, there are always trade-offs, and the cost of German automobiles, for example, is already too expensive. The EU is simply shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic. To safeguard their car industry, they're ready to blame farmers. Even that is a significant risk because Chinese EVs are now quite inexpensive. The basic problem of high production costs has not been overcome by a long shot. And unless the EU can find a cheaper supply of energy, it will be impossible to escape this economic nightmare. No amount of financial engineering or trade agreements will address the issue. But tell me what you think. Will US sanctions affect Russian gas? And will France ever find a way out? Please let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, like, and subscribe as we traverse these tumultuous times.